Hey folks, welcome back. This is going to be the final part of this project series where we are going to finish up this animation. If you haven't seen the other videos, make sure that you go back and check out those videos before doing this one so you know what's going on. We're going to be covering how to do this animation that you're going to see right here along this path. Plus, we're going to be adding some camera sway to it. I'm going to be showing you about how to make your render look the best possible with the Eevee render engine using some settings that we're going to set up over here. And I will also be showing you how to export your file so that you get an image sequence to be put into a editing software later to compile your final video animation. I will not be covering how to compile all this into one video because I already do have a tutorial on how to do that I'm going to have linked below in the video description, so make sure that you check that out when you get to the final stage of this project. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get started on this final stretch. What we should do before we add any animation to our camera here is that we need to make sure we have our general composition sort of set where we want it to be. And there is a way to do this where you kind of like keyframe certain positions and then you can do something afterwards to set that. But what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to take a look inside of the camera here, and if we are generally happy with where this is positioned right here, we can call that good. And in order for us to sort of like tag this position, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create our animation path for our camera before going any further. So I'm going to hit Shift A and we're going to add a Bezier here. And if we go into edit mode with tab and we select this position right here and we go to the side view with 3 and grab that and move that up where sort of like the back of the camera is right here, and we can set it just like that. But we need to also go overhead with 7 and move it so that it's more in line like that. And don't worry so much about this Bezier handle here. We can rotate this and move it around, but let's wait on that. So what we'll want to do next is if we select the camera again, go into our camera view with 0 on the numpad, hit N to open up this right here and click on View Lock, Camera to View like this. We can then sort of move around freely, and if your camera is sort of like stuck where it's not really doing a whole lot with moving when you use the middle mouse wheel or something, you can click on another object, hit period on the numpad, and it will lock to that like that. And then we can set where we want this to end up. And what we really want to do is we want to set it somewhere like this, where we're looking really close, and you can turn on rendered mode so that the previewing is a little bit easier, and we can sort of set it up like this here. Now there are going to be some things that we change that will make it to where it's not looking exactly like that, but this is generally how we might want to do this. And what we want to do at this point here is make sure that we have our camera selected, and you can select it from wherever it is in here. We will move around our groups here, but we can select our camera like this, and we can actually add a constraint. So right here you see object constraint properties, and we're going to add a track to. And what this does is it basically points the camera in a specific direction. And I'm going to open up this panel here. You don't have to do this. I'm going to turn off camera to view in this panel. And if we look at it from the side like this, if you take this track 2, you take the little eyedropper and you select an empty or even an object, it will, at that point, no matter where I move the camera, you see how it's always targeting that specific position. So let's go back to a position more kind of like this. And you can see that I'm using the light target here. You don't have to use the light target. You can create another empty if you'd like, but it really won't change too much if we move this around. So I'm actually going to grab this to get this centered a little bit more. I'm going to grab this and I'm going to move it on the Y. So it's a little bit more centered with the map like this. And then in this window, I'm just going to move this around so we get it a little bit more set up, a little bit centered like that, something like this. And that's basically how we want to set up the camera, or at least that's how I'm going to set it up right now for our final resting position. And if we select the curve and then grab our, or select the other point, the end here, and move it on Z, or just move it freely in a side view in this panel here, and then go to the top view and make sure that we have, see the points right there, move this over here like this. We can then sort of set up our path. Now, I want the path to be a little bit more kind of in line like this. So I'm going to rotate using R. I'm just going to rotate this from the top view so that it is a little bit more smooth like that. Then from this point here, you see how it goes kind of like that curve is pretty severe right there. I'm just going to rotate that a little bit like this. So it's a little bit more soft. And there's also something that you'll notice here. You see this, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a bend in our path that's pretty sharp, and we'll actually be able to see it when we start to animate along this path. So I'm going to go into the object mode here with tab, go to the properties right here. And for the resolution preview, let's just make this a 30. It's just one curve. It won't add a lot, and it'll make sure that our camera doesn't sort of like jitter around a little bit as it's moving along this path. And next we will, in this panel, let's just turn off the camera to view. And we are going to take the camera, if we select on it here, go to the object constraint properties, and then add a follow path right here. And with the target, click the little pipette or eyedropper and then select our curve. And you'll notice that something crazy happens. It kind of goes up over here. And that's because we have a setting. If we go to our location, you see here with transform, if we go to the items here, when you hit N and you open this up, see there's a location here. We have to zero this out, and we can easily do that with an Alt G. And you can see that it kind of like threw that thing kind of crazy, right? So let's take the follow path, move it above the track 2 like this, and you'll notice that it goes right where it needs to go. See that? And what we want to do at this point is we want to make sure that a couple things are set. So if we zoom in a little bit and we just sort of look at our, and I'm just going to change this to solid mode. You can see that this is in the middle where our target is, but the composition is a little bit weird. This is the table is no longer centered and it feels a little bit odd. So what we can do is we can actually look at this from a side view here, and we can move this down or up, but you'll notice that it stays right on that target, where we're not really seeing a whole lot going on as far as moving the position so that the table, the legs or whatever, are a little bit more centered in the frame. So what we'll want to do is we will want to grab our target here. And again, this really isn't a big deal as far as changing this location, even though we have our light over here sort of like connected to it. If I move this around, there's really not a whole lot that's going to happen when we do this as far as that light is concerned, and you really won't see it. You could add another empty, but we're not going to. And I'm going to go to the end frame here where we had it set, or a later frame where we had the camera sort of set at that position. And I'm just going to hit N here, and I'm going to insert a keyframe for this location because I'll want it to sort of remain where it was. But over here, what we'll want to do is we'll want to add some space, about 24 frames, for there to be a second of transition. You might want to do more, but I'm just going to do a second of transition from when we edit this into a clip or something like that. You'll want a little bit at the front, and at the end of your clip, you'll want a little bit of room for transition there. We are going to grab this on the Z, and we're just going to move this down a little bit until the table is a little bit more in the center of the frame and the feet are no longer just sort of like off the frame down there. I'm going to hit N, I'm going to right click and insert keyframe to set a keyframe there. So now it just slightly moves like this. And what we're also going to do is, I want a little bit more of this background showing, so I'm going to grab this, select the curve, go into edit mode, grab this, move it down a little bit on Z, and maybe this is more of a better composition where we're kind of down like this. And what you can do from this point is we can set this animation. So if we go right here where it says offset and we right click, insert keyframe, and then go to a later frame like this over here. We chose 220 for this one, but it doesn't have to be exactly the same as this one right here. We can then change this offset, and you can see as I go up, it goes behind or backwards. And if I go to a negative value, it goes towards. That's because of the direction of our path. And you could go in here into edit mode and then hit F3 and type in switch, and switch direction will then change that path so that if we change this to a 0 like this and go to this keyframe right here, see how it's set there. If we go to negative 100, you see how it goes back like this and then it goes forward. So it depends on the actual orientation of your curve as far as the direction that that's going. If you're not getting what you're seeing here as far as this tutorial is concerned, just go into that curve and switch the direction and you'll be fine. Or you could just change whatever the offset is just to make sure that you are making it go forward in space like this. So let's just take it back, and we can actually type in -100 right here and reset that keyframe, and then go to frame 220 like this and change this to a 0, set that keyframe, and now we have a little bit at the head. Then it moves into an animation like this, and it moves towards our map just like that, and then stays like that. Really nice. And what we can do from this point is if we take the curve and go into edit mode, we can actually rotate this a little bit if we want and start to create a little bit more of a path like this so it goes up and down. So we can play that, see what that looks like where it sort of comes up and then down, something like that. That'll work just fine, I think, for this animation. And you can fine tune this and make this as dynamic or whatever as you'd like for this motion path. Now, what a lot of people do is they'll say, okay, this is great, and they will render this out. And when you press play, you'll notice that there's a little bit of a strange thing that happens. If we turn off the overlays here and we just sort of watch this from the beginning, it's sort of motionless and then it goes into an animation and then it abruptly stops right in there. Now, this may not seem like a big deal to you, and if you have some automatic Beziers, like I showed you in the previous one, how to set those with the graph editor, and how you can do it down here with the easing modes and interpolation modes, this might be okay for you, but for me, in real life, and I used to be a jib operator at a news station, I know that when you set up a shot, no matter how much you practice, there's always going to be a little bit of sway or variation in how that camera is moving. And there's a couple ways that you can address this to make it look a little bit more natural by having some, I guess you can call it mistakes, where it sort of moves a little bit this way and that way, and there's some sway in the actual animation of the camera, just to make it look a little bit more realistic. There are some different ways to do this, but I'm going to show you the way that I like to do it because it's fast and it's easy. So if we open up the graph editor here, and you can see here is our offset. We really don't want to look at that. What we want to do is we actually want to open up this and go to frame 1 down here. Go to frame 1, go to item, and then right click insert keyframe. Now we're not going to do anything as far as actually keying the animation using this, but in order for us to do the next step, we need to have a key here in order to add, if you remember from the last one, a modifier. So let's actually open this up and you can see we have X, Y, and Z location. I'm going to turn off X and Y. You could do this for those, but Z is going to do what we want just fine. So if we zoom in a little bit and we're just going to move this over and move this over like this so you can see what I'm doing. And I'll hide those other panels so you can see what's happening over here. We are going to add a modifier. So if you hit N in this panel, you can open up your modifiers, add noise. And you can see there we have a whole bunch of stuff going on and it looks like we're in some sort of war zone and it's going crazy. So just like we did last time when we did the glowing on the light there, and I'm sorry if you're having trouble seeing this, I will stop that animation right now. We can scale this up so that it gets the wavelength there gets longer and longer. And if we scrub through it, you can see that there's quite a bit of sway going on, which is really crazy. And take the strength down to like a 0.1 maybe, or something like this, and then hit play. And you can see that there's that little bit of sway there. It's still a little bit too much, maybe a 0.025. So let's see what happens there. So there's a little bit of sway at the head, as if it's just getting ready. And I'm just going to zoom in a little bit like this so you can see what's going on. If I hit play, you can see there's a little bit of sway, and then it moves into the shot. And then when it gets to the resting position, right in there, there's going to be a little bit of sway as well. So just play with that. You can play with, if it seems like towards the end there's a little bit too much vibration going on, you can make this to where you can offset it a little bit or something like this. You can change the phase. You can do all sorts of things to sort of soften this or make this look as best as you'd like it to look. I'm actually going to take this last keyframe here and I'm going to move it more towards the end like this. And so then we have a start. It is going to move in just like this. And then as it gets towards the end, it's going to slow down, fade out, and there we go. Maybe give a little bit more breathing room for a transition. So something like that. So at this point, we're pretty much done with the camera and the animation that we're going to do there. And we need to set this up for a final render. So we want to set some specific render settings since we're using Eevee. We've just been using the defaults. And I want to make sure that we have enough samples and everything else to make this look really, really nice. So let's just move this over like this. we're going to go over to the render properties and we're going to change some things. We're not going to do the sampling right now, and we're going to leave the viewport denoising on, but let's start changing some of these items down here. So with ambient occlusion, we want to turn this on, and we really won't see a whole lot unless we move in and look at something a little bit closer like this. And if we turn on ambient occlusion, you can see that a shadow, hopefully you saw that, showed up right in here. So if we turn it on, turn it off, you can see there's a little bit of shadow going on, and the magnification up here is looking a little bit different. So this is going to make a lot more realism in our scene. It's going to allow us to see the proper shadows when objects are sort of like going next to the other like that. And we can change these here by using this distance. We can turn it up or turn it down. Let's just leave it at the 0.2. And for trace precision here, let's put it all the way up to 1. Now you probably noticed that there's a little bit of an issue here with this part of the magnifying glass. And if we go into the settings here, we can click on the lens, change this to alpha hashed, and now it looks like this. So we no longer have that weird thing happening. Turn on screen space refraction so that we can actually see what's going on when we turn on screen space refraction for the scene. And let's go back to our render properties. This option a lot of people like to use because if we zoom out a little bit and we turn that on, you can see that it adds a glow. But the thing is that you don't really want to bake this in, or what's called, baking is basically rendering in these effects like this. Even if it looks nice, let's add that later. So let's turn that off. The next thing here is the depth of field. So let's go ahead and set a depth of field. We're going to look through our camera and let's move to a little bit more closer like this. And what we'll do here is we'll just set all this stuff up so that we get the highest quality possible. And we are going to select our camera, go to the camera here, the camera properties, click on depth of field, and we are going to, you can see everything went blurry there. We're going to select our light target as the object. And you can see if we look in the far, far background, there's a blur going on back there. And if we look at this right here, it's nice and clear. So you can set whatever f-stop you like. The lower the value, the more blurry it gets. The higher the value, more clear it gets. But let's just set this at a 2.5, or we can reset the default value at a 2.8 like that. And let's go back to our render setting and leave it just like that. There's more things we could do, but this should be just fine. Subsurface scattering, nothing in our scene needs this, so we don't need to worry about that. Screen space reflections, click that on and select the refraction. What we'll want to do also is take off the half res and take the trace precision all the way up and leave the rest alone. We'll be fine with those settings like that. Just really quick so that you know how to do this, I left this sort of more opaque because I just kind of didn't care when I was making the recording earlier. But if this bothers you and you want it to be more see-through like what you see in the intro and the outro of the videos I've been showing, all you really have to do is make sure that you have this material selected and then go to the alpha right here and just turn this down until you can see through it and you can see the map through it right there. So very easy to fix that. I just wanted to throw this in there so that you knew how to do it in case you were being frustrated by that. Next is the motion blur, so let's go ahead and turn that on. And I'm just going to show you briefly how this works. If I hit 0 on the numpad over here and I move to a frame where there's motion going on like this right here, we can start to take a look at what happens. So I'm going to leave these just the default. And we're going to do a quick render, so we'll hit F12, and this is what it looks like right now. So let's just make this a little bit larger, and I'm going to zoom in, and this is how I recommend doing these tests. We did a render, we're going to take a look at it here, change this to slot 2, and we're going to render a second image that we are going to A/B or compare against the other. So if we change this here, this shutter to a 2.0, and leave the steps just at 1 because I want to show you something. So if we render that out, you can see that now there is a motion blur going on and there's all sorts of craziness. And if I hit J, it will compare one to the other. So here was with 0.5, and then this one here is a 2.0. You can see the difference there. And it's a little bit too much, so let's change the shutter to a 1 and see what that's like. Let's make sure that we have this set to slot 2 and render that. And you can see here, if we compare those two, that looks a little bit better. So we're going to keep it at a 1 for the shutter, but let's do something else. Let's change this to slot 1. And slot 1, we are going to change the steps here. Let's change this to 15, okay? And hit F12, and let's see what happens. And if we take a look, slot 1, slot 2, slot 1, slot 2. So you can see that the steps changes how this is rendering. So let's also go to sampling, and we're going to change this sampling here. Instead of 64, let's do 256, okay? And let's render that. And you can see there that when we added that, the weird sort of noise that we saw right here went away. And if we compare these two, you can see the difference there, slot 1 and slot 2. So I do recommend that you do some testing. I'm going to change this to 30 steps and see how that looks. The more steps, the longer it takes to calculate. Let's go ahead and render that and see what that looks like. And A, B, the 2. And this one might look a little bit better, but I think we're going to go with this one because the more samples, the better. And the more steps, generally, the more realistic you're going to get as far as the motion blur is concerned. So let's go back to our scene here. Let's close this up for the motion blur. And let's go down to performance, turn on high quality normals. Volumetrics, we don't have volumetrics, so we can turn that off actually. Same thing with the volumetric shadows. You don't need any of this unless you're adding that in your scene. Shadows, basically, all we really need to worry about is this cube size right here. And I'm going to say that this kind of depends on what you want to do. If you change this to 4096, you'll end up with more sort of detailed shadows. There's going to be a lot more going on here. And we also want this right here, the high bit depth. So make sure that you turn that on, and soft shadows. And 64, you can see it gets a lot more blurred out. And it's basically like a larger cube map or a smaller cube map. And then if we change this to a higher value, you can see how that looks there. And as we add more render samples here, you could take this viewport and you can turn this to like 256 just so that you can actually see what it looks like in your final render and compare it. You can see that it looks a lot nicer when we have a lot more samples going on with those shadows. So I'm going to change this back to 16. And we're going to keep this pretty much set something like this. You can even try 2048 if you'd like. But really this, when you start getting up in these higher values, there's not that much of a difference. So let's just keep it at 2048. Next, what we want to do is we want to make sure that our lighting is not going to blow out any highlights or something. And a lot of people like to use the color management that's set as default, which is this filmic here, because it clamps. It's what is called clamping. It will clamp the highlights so that it's more of a reasonable film-like look to it, and that's why it's called filmic. But let's change this to standard because we're going to change how this looks according to what we want it to look like instead of just a pre-built system. So let's change this to standard, and that's going to be more or less what the color profile is going to look like. And we can change this color profile in DaVinci Resolve or even in this program. But let's also take a look at this false color right here. And this is a step a lot of people miss. You want to be careful of these red bits right here. The red means that it's going to be blown out. Okay, so when we go like this, we can see that the red is pretty bright, and that means that we're not going to get to mess around a whole lot with the color information at the end when we do a render because of the red bits right there. So what we might want to do is go into our point light that's inside of this right here. And we will want to go to where that's keyframed, bring up our lighting, and change this to something like a 5 where it's not as blown out, and then replace that keyframe. And now when we take a look at this, it's still blown out in some areas, but we can add a little highlight there to make it look nice, and it's not going to be as blown out as it was before. So let's take this, change this back to standard, and that's what our scene's going to look like. Keep in mind that we will be changing the overall coloring and lighting, or the lightness and brightness and everything else, the contrast later, and this looks just fine. So I recommend at this point doing a couple more test renders and stuff like that, and we are going to do a render to just set some color parameters and things like that before we do a final render. So let's render this frame like this, hitting F12, and there's our frame. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the compositor. We're going to click on Use Nodes, and we're going to take a look at this. Make sure you have Node Wrangler turned on. Click on this right here, Control Shift left click, and it basically creates this viewer here. And we'll go to View and Fit. and that's going to make it fit like this. Normally I would use my other monitor so that I could see the color as I change it, but I'm just going to show it to you in here. You would want to basically open up your render like this and change this to search for viewer like that, viewer node, and it's going to change this window to match what you're seeing in the viewer here, okay? And the other thing that you'll want to do, and I'm going to have this open on the other screen so you won't see this, is if we turn on, if you hit N, go to scopes and open this up right here, you'll see this right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a method to change this around so that we get a little bit more contrast and we can move some values around, okay? So that's going to be on my other monitor and you're not going to see that. So I'm going to add with Shift A here, color balance like this, and we're going to move this right in there. Control Shift left click so we can view through that. And basically this is a method that I do for almost everything. It's probably not the best, but it's what I do. And I'm only going to do this in this program because I'm going to show you sort of like the methodology behind it. But you want to do this in something like DaVinci Resolve or Premiere after you render out your individual images. You don't really want to bake this in. Now, a lot of you are just going to bake it in anyway, and that's why I'm going to show you how to do this. But just FYI, what you'll want to do is save out a sequence of images and then do this on the back end to change the color information and render out your video that way so you can add some effects and stuff. But I'm going to show you generally the method here, and I will put a link in the video description so you can check out how to make some alterations to this inside of DaVinci Resolve. So what I like to do is take this middle one here. This is lift, gamma, and gain. Take the gamma right here, push this down a little bit so that we can just kind of like increase our contrast by lifting this lift right here and by lifting this right here. And what I'm doing on the other screen is I'm taking a look at this, and the blacks should be somewhere around the red, and the whites you don't want to be all pushed up towards the very, very, very top. So let's move that out of the way there, and just know that I'm doing that on my other screen as I am making these fixes. So something sort of like this might be what I want to do. And you can notice here, I'm going to pull this over and we're going to zoom in. You can notice how warm this is. It's very, very warm. And I touched on this when we talked about the coloring inside of our scene. And we do have this to sort of offset some of that warmness, but it's still quite a bit warm. And what we can do is we can actually take these values right here and we can hold Shift, left click, and drag these around and change the color profile of this. And you can see that there was a little bit of a change there. So if we go like this and move this around like that, and if we move this around in this direction, you can see how much the actual color is changing. So maybe something like that to get the general coloring and just to offset some of that weird orangey look that we were getting with that over there. Now you don't have to do this. You can always use that filmic LUT from your render properties if you like, but I like creating the color balance on my own like this. So let's also, what we want to do is we will add a filter. We will add a glare eventually because everybody likes to see those really cool glow effects. And let's just put this right in here. Take a look through the glare node, and we want this to be a fog glow. And you can make some edits, change this around if you'd like, but I'm just going to do this really quick, set a high for that, and filter this into our color balance node and take a look through there. And now we have, let's just pull this up. Now we have a glow effect like that that is added in post, so we don't have to bake it in, and we can always change these values as much as we'd like. What you might want to do next is add a distort, lens distortion, and put it right on the back end here. Click fit, and I always like to put a 0.01 and a 0.01 here. And basically what that does is it adds a little bit of what's called a dispersion at the very, very edges. There's a little bit of green and red dispersion effect at the very edge, and it sort of does a little bit of a warping of the image just to add a little bit more realism that it's shot using a camera lens instead of inside of a CGI program. And what I always do at the very, very end, especially if I'm using Eevee, is I would put noise. You want to do an animated noise at the end here, but this compositor doesn't allow you, as far as I know, to add noise into it from the compositor screen. So we're not going to be able to add that here, but that is something that you want to do. You want there to be noise in your image. Okay, not too much, but you want some. If it is completely clean, it'll look fake. So you want to add at least a little bit of that noise in there to make it look more realistic. And what you'd want to do is not just have this in the viewer. If you're going to bake this in, you need to make sure that this is put into your composite like this. But for me, I would do it like this because I want to do all of these changes later. And what you'll want to do from here is check a couple more frames, check the middle, check the head of the shot, check the end, make sure everything is set where you want it to be. And if you're going to bake this in here, that's definitely what you want to do because you want to make sure that everything is set correctly. And for our final, go to your render properties and make sure you do at least 150%. So when you do your final, if the final that you're going to render out to send to a client is 1920 by 1080, you want there to be a little bit higher quality, at least 150. I always do 200. If the final was 4K, I would set these parameters to 4K parameters and then set this to 200% still. And that's a pretty big image, but that's how you want to do this. You want it to be a bigger image and then scale it down later for your final because you get much higher quality by doing that. But for you all, let's just do this at a 150% and let's set our output settings. This is going to be very important for those of you who don't know how to render this out according to naming conventions and all that. What you'll want to do is if you don't really want to do a whole lot with this and you're baking in all of your color information, everything, you still want to do a PNG sequence and you want to set the compression down to 0 and keep the color depth at 8. Since we're doing video, 8 is just fine. But for those of you who want to do the coloring later, you'll want to use an EXR format. So an open EXR like this, that will give you as much information as you can get for doing all the color edits like what you're seeing right here. You could do it with a PNG, but EXR is better. It's just a lot larger of an image. So let's go into the output settings like this. And you'll want to navigate to that render folder that we created and add a folder here, and you'll want to call this EXR. Go in there and we're going to do the following. You're going to name this whatever the project is. So you can call this map, animation, scene, and you want to put usually a version on there. So if this is the first version, V1 like this, or version 01, put a period, and then we want to do our frame padding for the frames that we have here. So I'm going to do 4 frames of padding. So it'll be 0001, for example, for frame 1, and 0100 for frame 100, .exr. And that is how you'll want to do your naming convention for this, because you'll have the frame padding separated and you'll have this part be able to say what the version is and what the project is, and we will click accept. And then from there, make sure that you save your file. I'm going to save this as version 4, save, and I'm going to set my sampling a little bit higher. I'm actually going to use 512, and we'll go to render and then render animation, and it's going to set all of those images right in that folder. If we go into that folder, you can see that I have the frames being set right there inside of my folder. Now, there are some things you might want to do. You might want to do a low resolution render of your entire animation or do a viewport render to see what the full animation looks like in this form right here so that you could just see how the overall animation is going to go. But I'm just assuming that you've done that, and we are going to let this render out, and I will see you in the back end. Okay, so there we have it. All 250 frames have been rendered. Now keep this in mind. I did 250 frames just to keep it at the default, but make sure you set your animation for whatever the actual length of your animation needs to be. So you set that up correctly. And that's actually going to be it for this whole tutorial series. I hope you've been able to follow along with me and learn a lot about my process, sort of like the standard for how these projects are created in the industry, and just in general how to create a professional looking video animation from beginning to end, all inside of Blender. Make sure that you're subscribed so that you can see all of the content that is created as soon as it's released, and hit the little bell icon to be notified when they're released. And if you haven't yet, make sure that you check out the rest of my YouTube channel for a lot more projects like this. Thanks so much to all of my YouTube members and patrons. You give me a lot of reason to keep doing what I'm doing, so thank you so much. If you'd like to be put on this list here, you can become a patron by clicking the link down in the video description below. And I will see you all next time on DJ Tutorials.